This is a page lecture for page 13 of the History of Visual Technology, 3rd edition, by James Janossy. Page 13 in the History of Visual Technology, 3rd edition, looks like this. In this one page, I tell you about dates that are specific to the kind of artwork and the kind of historical periods we study, which include the dates that you see here on the screen: BC, AD, BCE, before Common Era, and before present dates. The little QR code at the lower right by the slide number is a way to access this page. This slide extracts from page 13 the illustration in the center. What you see here is more or less a timeline centered on a fictitious year zero. There is no year zero. In this scheme of negative and positive number dating, the birth of Christ is taken as an instant in time, and the dates run backwards from that. You can think about them as -1, -2, -3. They're called before Christ, so 1 BC, 2 BC, and they run in the positive direction from that point onward, the year 1, the year 2, the year 3, 4, 5. So there is no year zero. We're going to explore some common ways that dates are referred to in history books and in the field of art, which I think you really need to understand in order to have a comfortable feeling and a time perspective that is accurate. Before Christ dates run in a negative direction, but we don't talk about them as being negative numbers. 100 BC, 200 BC, 300 BC. Dates after the birth of Christ are thought about as positive numbers. The letters AD for Anno Domini, that's Latin for in the year of our Lord, the AD placed before the numbers of the year. Let's take the dates that run in a positive direction first. Those are the dates that are the times that we live in. We start with the 1st century, and dates run in a forward direction. So far, so good. Now, we don't usually put the Anno Domini AD in association with the date unless we're trying to clarify something. Perhaps we're close to that 0 point, and we want to make sure people understand which side of it we're on. The AD, if you use it, comes before the numbers. However, there's a newer way to state this that attempts to get away from the bias of religion implied by the Anno Domini in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ, and that uses the letters CE for Common Era. If the date is written that way, then the letters are put after the number. So 2012 CE, as opposed to what you saw earlier, AD 2012. Even when the date numbers are taken to be in a positive sense, there is some possibility of misunderstanding what time period we're talking about, because the century number that we talk about is one less than the first digit or two of the year. In other words, the years that occurred before 100 are called first century dates. So those are the dates from year 1 through year 99. The 2nd century starts with the year 100. You might think the 2nd century starts with the year 200, but that's the 3rd century. So here, as we move forward in time, you always have to think a little bit about what we're talking about when things are referred to, for example, as the 17th century or the 19th century or the 20th century. For example, the date commonly taken as the date that Rome fell, actually it had been falling apart for a long time, and some parts of it continued to remain after 476 AD, but that occurred in the 5th century, as you see on this marking on a timeline. It didn't occur in the 4th century. And coming closer to home, if we took a look at the year in which America celebrated its 100th anniversary, 1876, that's the 19th century. And the year that the Titanic sunk, 1912, was actually in the 20th century. And the year that we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic, the century we're in right now, is the 21st century. That's just something you have to get used to. You'll find that a lot of references in the story of art are based on century. The 7th century, the 8th century, the 10th, the 12th, the 15th century. To get it straight, what that really means in terms of specific dates, you have to keep in mind that that century number is one greater than the first 2 digits of the year we're talking about. Let's take a look at before Christ dates, that is BC dates. This gets even a little more complicated. It seems straightforward, but it does bend your mind a bit because these dates run in a backwards direction. In other words, 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th, 5th, onward, that's all going back farther in time, not coming forward. So for example, the date 2560 before Christ. 2560 BC, when the Great Pyramid of Khufu was finally completed, it's actually in the 26th century BC. Not so common to refer to the centuries that far back by names like that. Closer to the year zero, that fictitious point when -1 turns into 1, closer to that time, people do refer to the centuries BC, and you'll see that introduces a bit of a complication. When BC is used, it's put after the numbers, 2560 before Christ or 2560 before Christ. Just as we have a description that is neutral as to religion in terms of common era, we have before common era, and those letters, if used to clarify what we're talking about in terms of a date, are also placed after the numbers, so 2560 BCE, before common era. Here's where things get a little bit complicated. We have a date 336 BC. So here we have the date 336 before Christ, 336 BC, the year in which Alexander the Great conquered the Persians in the final battle in the wars between the Greeks and the Persians, and the Greeks became ascendant in that area of the world. What century is it in? It's in the 4th century BC. Now you'll notice there's also a 4th century AD. Here's where things get a little bit sticky. Sometimes the people who know a lot about history, who write history books, just want to make sure that you know how smart they are, and they refer to some historical event, for example, the conquest of the Persians by Alexander the Great in the 4th century, and they don't say BC. Because they're so smart and so into the subject matter, they know that Alexander the Great only lived in BC. There was no Alexander the Great in 336 AD in the 4th century in the positive sense, but they'll refer to it as an event in the 4th century, figuring that the reader certainly is as smart as they are in understanding that that 336 date is BC. Well, you'll find some of that in the Gombrich text. I don't think he's trying to show how smart he is. He's just following the common convention. So as you see, 336 BC is actually the 4th century BC. It's 4th century Greece. Now I just shrunk that illustration from page 13 on this page so that I could fit in some arrows showing you how far back we go in this course. And in the positive direction, the book actually goes right on up to modern times, but in the course I'm conducting here, GPH 205, we only use through chapter 25, which goes up to about 1900 AD. I just wanted to point out to you, since we're on the subject more or less of timelines, that there's some marvelous resources in the back of The Story of Art, the 16th edition. Starting on page 656, there's some timelines followed by some maps. A timeline that starts on page 656 and extends to page 657 really is excellent, and it will help you put the vast expanse of ancient to modern history into perspective so you can form some ideas in your mind, like a map, of how these things fit together. The little timeline I've shown you only focuses on the 500 years before and after Christ in order to be legible on the page, and because that's where some of the events of Units 1 and 2 actually occur. I hope this has helped you understand page 13. You'll get a little more out of the subject matter if you actually read that page as well, but since different people learn in different ways, I like to provide these page lectures that cover the same material that I would have covered had I presented this in a classroom in about 10 minutes.